Okay, good evening, everyone. Glad to see everyone this evening, though it is cold and rainy, and hopefully the last cold wave that we have for a little while. There are quite a few things that have actually taken place over the past few days. Um, the Conjure family, the Taylor family, and the Lumpkins, there is a possible breakout of disease among them, so they will not be here this evening because I got a phone call. They want to be considerate of everyone. So we need to be praying for them for hopefully no sicknesses, but if there are, that quickly passes. Secondly, we need to be praying for the Lipe family. We announced about Pete Lipe last Wednesday. He passed away this past Sunday, and the funeral service is this evening, and that's where David and Sandra are. If we get an address for like sending sympathy cards or something, we'll post that up on the board on Sunday, or if I can find it tonight, it'll be tonight. So be praying for the Lipe family and also the friends of the Lipe family. And then I have a personal request, one we got last week, and we got word back today of more information. If you can be praying for Mary and Frank Google Chuck. Yes, you'll remember Google Chuck. Mary and Frank Google Chuck. We've been asked if we can go do a Bible study with them. They are not Christians, but their daughter is a Christian. She attends at a congregation in Middle Tennessee. Be praying for that, because that's not something I like to just walk up to people's doors and say, hey, your child's concerned about you. But if you could be praying that God can open a door for us to be able to reach them, that would be amazing. In fact, that is like one of the big goals, at least for me personally, in terms of preaching here, I want to get involved with, is just meeting new people across Rogersville. See if we can set up Bible studies. If it's your own friends or family members, let's get it going. Not necessarily force the Bible study, but allow God to naturally open up a door so that we can reach out to them. So if you can be praying for them, for the Google Chuck family, also be praying for me, because I need to find a way to be able to reach them in a normal way. So the Google Chuck family, be praying for them for possible Bible study, the Lipe family, and then also for the Condras, the Taylors, and the Lumpkins for containing potential sickness that they have right now. Oh, okay. Very good. Are they going to do that, I guess, soon? Oh, okay. Okay. Very good. So, outside of you have nothing, that's the best. Okay, that's awesome. Okay, so be praying for Jerry Seymour. Thankfully, good results, but not quite out of the park. He needs to go see the doctor soon. Okay. Okay. David, can you lead us in a word of prayer before we begin? Amen. Thank you. Okay, tonight I do not have a clicker. Can you hand me a clicker from back there? It's on the table. I had one right here. Now I'm concerned. We need prayers for the missing clicker. Yes. Okay, last week we were looking at a lot of different texts from Ecclesiastes. Specifically, the section of text that we were looking at was chapters 2 and 3. And there's so much that we can learn from those chapters alone. And really the emphasis of those chapters is what Solomon ended chapter 1 with, is that I set my heart to search out with all wisdom things pertaining to mirth and folly, madness and folly. And he begins this experimentation by looking at what really brings about true joy. And he examines what the physical pleasures or enjoyments of life can be. And we even looked at some of the divisions of those. I mean, it was just, he just constantly kept talking about, well, what if you add this to the equation of life? Or what if you take this way? Or what? And he keeps going through all these hypotheticals. And what he ultimately reaches in his conclusion of this whole first testing, tried and testing, is what we read in chapter 3, verse 22. He would say, I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own work, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? And it's in that question alone, chapters 4 through 6, is going to show us a second observation. It's almost like if you're doing tests on something and you see this pattern come up over and over again, you may make like a side note next to that saying, I think the evidence is going here. And then you do some more experimentation. And then at the end of that experimentation, okay, it's still going this direction. Solomon's going to do that 3 times. And we'll talk about that when we get to the main application of this text. And what we want to focus on this evening is where chapter 4 begins. In that Solomon saw, after he saw this as God's given task to mankind to enjoy their labors, notice he will begin in chapter 4, I returned and consider all the oppression that is done under the sun. Now, what I don't want to do with this text is just go through it verse by verse. When you look through this text, there's actually 3 different divisions among these 3 chapters that deal with different types of oppression. When we think of oppression, we tend to think of something like slavery during the Civil War. We tend to think of oppression like what happened with the Jews in World War II under the Nazi regime. That is a type of oppression. But there's also different levels of oppression. If we're not careful, we might actually limit that field of what God says, okay, this is really what can mess with your joy. And that's the idea. What can oppress the true joy that I find in life? And there's 3 different areas that Solomon talks about. First off, he talks about outside forces, not like illegal immigrants or aliens. What I mean is other people. Other people affect what you do on a daily basis, don't they? I mean, when you're on the road, you find yourself being the only person driving. So there is a sense in which other people do affect your dreams, your hopes, and what you labor for, and they even affect like why you're even doing those things. Secondly, we find there's oppression from myself. Sometimes I can be the main reason as to why I'm experiencing unhappiness and not even realize it. We do have to consider, if you look in verse 1, verse 4, and verse 7 of chapter 4, notice he would say, I saw. He's making personal observations as he goes through this experimentation to figure out, what if I use joy and pleasure as my main goal in life? Well, he looks at himself a lot through this text. And lastly, he looks at, oppression can just be caused by the reality of things. We're going to read a certain account at the end of chapter 4 where there was a poor young man. And Solomon would say that man is much better in life than the old king who is arrogant and haughty, and nobody takes pleasure when that king dies. But this young man, he started in prison, he was born in poverty, and then he was brought up into kinghood, and then he talks about a generation after him. Another youth is put in his place. And then what happens? Well, it's the same cycle. It doesn't matter if you're born rich or you're born poor. It's not about the money. It's about how you utilize where you find yourself in life. So maybe the reality of life is what's causing me oppression. And it's going to take us into deeper questions here a little bit later on. But I want us to think specifically on us because of this reason. Sometimes I tend to look at other people for the causes of my problems, where the Bible would say, I need to look at me. I need to get the beam out of my eye. I need to consider what's going on with me. And it forces me, as I read through Ecclesiastes, do I actually see reality the way that the preacher is presenting his findings in life? Literally, if I want to gain wisdom beyond my years, where am I going to look to find the answer? So we're going to look at this in three ways tonight, and we'll kind of somewhat take our time. The reason I want a whole lot of time with this is because there's some really deep concepts in here that are not for just simple discussion. I mean, I do want discussion with this, but a lot of this is going to take place within tonight as we discuss things about things that we find around us. I want us to begin with the present circumstance. If I want to get a really biblical view of how I can live with these different levels of oppression or what may be seen as a preventative measure or a wall that I'm hitting in my life, how do I work with this? Let's start with the present, and then we'll kick to the past, and then we'll look to the future. Actually, we'll look beyond time for our final answer. When I look for seeking answers of our time, I want us to consider what we find from verse 1, 4, and 7. Again, Solomon would say, I saw, I saw, I saw. And then I want us to read the beginning of chapter 5, because chapter 5 hurts when you really think about it in the grand scheme of things, but also it could hurt worse when you look at you, yourself, and I. When you look in chapter 4, notice Solomon would write, I returned and considered all the oppression that's done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors, there's power, but they have no comforter. Therefore, I praise the dead who were already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who had never existed, who had not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Now, he's not saying it's better to be dead than to be living. What he's saying is that there are some circumstances, when you look at examining life by enjoying it with just simple pleasures, there are some people, have you seen it, who abuse their power and position, and they take advantage of other people. It happens. There are bad choices being made all across human history. And the oppression that Solomon begins with is that I looked at people that I couldn't even help. They were crying for a deliverer, and I could do nothing. And he would continue in verse 4 by saying, so I looked and I saw all the toil, every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. What if I'm oppressed by those who are closest to me, and they're not telling me that they're jealous or they're envious, but some of the ways that they respond to me, it's as if they have a secret desire to want to have what I have. That is considered as an evil or an oppression of sorts. And when you look at the reality that Solomon is saying, this is an individual who is vain and grasping for the wind. It happens everywhere. The fool folds his own hands, he consumes his own flesh, and better is a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. So I returned again, and I saw vanity under the sun. There's one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother. Yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This is also a vanity and a grave misfortune. It hurts to live life alone. And Solomon gets that. We're made to be social creatures. Now, most people will go back to Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, and they'll talk about this is why people are to get married. You don't have to get married in order to have friends. Jesus didn't get married. Look at all the people he came in contact with. Paul didn't get married. And look at all the people he made a difference in their lives. Sometimes we tend to associate pleasure or a good life with one that is married. No, according to 1 Corinthians 7, you have a choice in the matter. Both of those are callings in life, but you don't have to choose one or the other. I mean, ultimately you do, but it's not like, oh, it's so much better this way. Don't miss what Solomon is saying. If you try to go through this life by yourself, you will fail. Notice what he begins by saying in verse number 8. This is what's vain, one alone, without, literally in the Hebrew, without a second. He has no son, he has no brother, yet there is no end to all his labors. Why is there no end? Because he never asked the question, what exactly am I working for? Is it just seem like time is passing by and I'm getting no gratification from this? So when I began by looking at, okay, what if I'm trying to figure all this out by myself? And I'm not trying to extend into what God says, this is what makes 1, verse 6, better. In fact, if you look across chapter 3 and chapter 4 and 5 and 6, all throughout Ecclesiastes, it would be I don't want to call it a fun exercise, it's a very insightful exercise. If you highlight or write down every reference where the word better is found. What that tells me is, as I read, is that God is saying this will give you a better life. So if you find your life full of bitterness and resentment, maybe you can find some respect and betterment in your life by following the wisdom that God provides through here. But I want to present one other thing. Sometimes we fail to find answers in life because we're trying to do everything by ourselves. But I also want us to look in chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Now, 1 through 7 talk about an individual who goes to the house of God. We're going to examine this here in just a moment. And when you look at verse 8 and 9, it talks about poverty again. Now, I find this interesting because this is what's going on in America right now. It's as if God already knew this is going to happen, not simply in America, but it happens across all time. Notice in chapter 5, verse 8, if you see the oppression of the poor and violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, another way of saying that, if you find your government is corrupt, do not marvel at the matter. High official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. I think it's called the Hindenburg trials. Is that where the officers of the Nazi regime were tried for their war crimes in Germany and all over Europe? When they gave the sentence for the people who did the things that Hitler had asked them to do, and they were saying, what law did we violate? He would say, you've not violated a law of the land, you have violated a higher power. They utilized Scripture to make a moral decision on justice and law. Is that wrong? No. Who gave government to be an existing body from the very beginning? God. Romans 13 tells me this. The government is supposed to be God's minister for justice and for exacting punishment if one violates the law. That's not a matter for you and I to take into our hands, though that is a privilege or a right that our legislation or our government places into our hands by a voting system. But that doesn't always mean that the people who are voted in our democracy are necessarily the greatest moral individuals. They're human beings. But what I do find here is that a lot of people make a big hado over government happenings when the Bible would tell me, notice again, middle of verse number 8, don't marvel at the matter. I hate looking at Facebook right now because that seems to be what a lot of people only talk about, and it drives me crazy. That's not why they should not do it. What the Bible tells me is that why are you impressed at this? That this is going to happen. If you have a government and you have people, problems are going to happen. Eventually they're going to. And I find it interesting as well. Think about all the kings in the divided kingdom that did evil and wickedness and oppressed God's people. And then how many good kings do we find? Do we find more bad kings or good kings in the divided kingdom? Bad. What does that mean about our government? In the long haul, we're going to have some bad apples every now and then. The ones that never rained. Jesus. Huh? Now, Josiah was seen as a righteous man. I don't know if it necessarily... So this kind of goes into some other conversations. I'll need to look into it. I don't think it records a sin that he did per se, but that doesn't mean that he didn't sin, because that was... Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of what we find from Josiah, actually, it's interesting that his name's brought up. He went through a reform across all of Israel. What are we seeing in our nation right now? Which brings up the question, what does a reform look like when we're trying to weed out the bad and bring in the good? And there's a lot of opinions on the matter. But in terms of morality, Josiah was trying to simply bring the nation back to where it was supposed to be. And don't make connections to that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just simply saying in the biblical text, it's interesting to think, how did people look at Josiah at that time? Were there whisperers and gossipers about, well, he doesn't have the right to do this, or there were people supporting him? And I don't know, but I think a lot of stuff that's going on today has a lot of similar parallels to today. Good question. I'm getting off track now. But here's the point. Don't worry about that. Here's what you need to worry about. If you consider yourself someone who loves God, I would really meditate on chapter 5, 1 through 7 a lot. What Solomon ends up emphasizing in the middle of the text, this is the only time that he brings up this idea of going to the house of God. And it's really weird because it's in the middle of, what if I test my life with mirth, with joy, and that is what I find to be the fulfillment of my life. He would say, walk prudently when you go to the house of God and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. Now, notice this last part. They do not know that they do evil. We're going to come back to that idea here in a second. Do not be rash with your mouth, and do not let your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. And when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. So do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God, he was in error. For why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words, there is also vanity, but fear God. I find this text interesting in here for this reason. Everything that you have had to some degree, been given to you by who? God. Everything you have, whether direct influence or side influence, that is your God-given portion, your heritage in this life. What you do with it is your choice in the matter. But I find it interesting in discussion of what brings me joy, and he's talking about all these physical things. I think he goes back to the idea, who did you pray to get all these things? When you go back to God and you thank Him, or you ask Him to give you more, or take away your burdens, or take away what you thought would be a blessing, but really it turned out to be a blister in the grand scheme of things, what happens when you go to the house of God? Does God say, oh, they're back again, they're just going to make all these requests? Notice the term Solomon uses here. Walk with wisdom when you go to the house of God. When I come to God's house, or even in light of like personal Bible study, when I'm preparing a lesson or I'm thinking of how does this apply to me, and I'm reading these ideas, I don't think I'm getting any closer to God's house than what I read about God's house in the book that tells me about God's house, the pillar and ground of the truth, 1 Timothy chapter 3, 15 and following. But walk with wisdom when you go to the house of God. What are we to do? Draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. Now, is that word singular or plural for fools? Plural. It seems like even in Solomon's day, people came to worship God and they had no idea what they were actually doing. Do you know why you're here? I'm flattered if you say of me, but then we need to have a talk. Yes. And all they do is talk, talk, talk. Have you met someone who all they do is just talk your ear off? And they don't want to hear anything you have to say. And it may not be necessarily that they don't want to hear what you have to say. It could just be their personality. There are people like that. But that's the point. They want to have their say when they go before God. And then, God, just do something about it. And they kind of treat him like the businessman who has his entire schedule full or her entire schedule full, and I just don't have time to talk to God today. So, God, here's what I need you to do. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, see you later, man. And then you go off, and then if God doesn't do it, you get angry at God. Well, I look at passages like James chapter 4, verse 1, which tells me that, sometimes I can pray for things amiss, that I may consume it upon my own lust and passion. Now, we tend to think of lust and passion as a negative, sinful thing, and it does incorporate that. But sometimes it could be our obsessions or our loves for certain hobbies or activities or even skills that we're really good at, which may bring up why we read back in chapter 4 that there was a man who was envied by his neighbor in verse 4. But when I look at this idea, someone who wants to talk to God and tell him all the things that he wants, but he doesn't want to hear anything that God wants. That's not wise. If you're simply coming to God for that purpose, you're missing the point. In a sense, God is here to give you things, but you're not here for the sole cause of Him giving you things. You're here because He wants you to be with Him. That is the drive. No matter where you are in life, God made you so that you can have a chance for eternal life. Now, when I look at how people respond to this, notice in verse number 4 and 5, there are a lot of people who say, God, let's make a deal. If you do this for me, I'll give you this. Let's go to our top prizes. God, if you can simply send me a wife or send me a husband, I will be a better man for you and I will appreciate you. God, if you just give me a better job or give me more money, I will love you and I will appreciate you. God, if you can simply give me a child, bless me with children, let me have a heritage of the fruit of my loom, then Lord, I will love you more. God, if you make me smarter or you make me handsomer or more beautiful, I will give my life to you. Solomon is saying this again for the reason more people like to talk to God than allowing God to talk to them. How many people make promises to God and don't keep their promises? That's the point Solomon is getting at. Sometimes I find myself having a hard time in the present because I don't actually understand what it is that I'm doing before God Almighty. Notice in verse number 5, he would say, don't make promises to God that you're not going to keep. I mean, God already sees what you're going to do. I tend to think of 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2, when Hannah, the wife of Elkanah, would go before God and say, Lord, give me a male child or a boy. Just give me a boy, and I promise I'll give him to you all the days of his life. And she did. And what's interesting about that transaction is that if you give God something temporarily in your time that you're here on earth, and I'm using temporary as in we see it as our entire lifetime, we're giving something to God, do we not think that God will give it back eternally in the life to come? See, a lot of people want to talk about the moments here and the moments now, and those are important. God gives us those things to enjoy, but to what extent? God, I thank you, you've given me all these wonderful things, And now that you've given it to me, see you, man. And he never hears from you. And there's a lot of people like that. Just think of people who unfortunately abuse the concept of true poverty in America. People who stand on street corners, and a lot of them seemingly are in desperate need, and they do want something, but they don't actually have a need. And it makes those who do have genuine needs much harder to identify, which is why God says, be wise. If you're going to ask God for something, don't make a promise and not keep that vow. Verse 6. And notice this in verse 6 and 7. God sees when you ask Him for something and then you abuse it and then you turn around and say, oh, no, I'm sorry. We would call that a quibbling child who got caught in the act, and they're sad and they're afraid because they got caught. Notice the terms that Solomon uses from God's perspective here in verse 6. Why should you cause your flesh to sin or say before the messenger of God, it was a mistake? It was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your excuse? Your excuse. Why can't you take something that maybe you didn't want or something you're not very skilled at? Think of the man with one talent. Did God praise that man because he did nothing with that talent? No, He criticized him. In fact, He would say, I gave you a talent. You could have at least put it in the bank and it would have gained interest, and I would have collected it when I came back. Everything that we have in using Matthew 25 is, in a sense, a good from the Master. And we have to return all those things back to God. Oh, get this. This is not just physical possessions. I am humbled when I listen to older people. I'm talking they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I listen to their perspective of parenting. And some of them will say something to this extent. When God blessed our family with children, I turned to my wife, or in some cases, the wife would turn to her husband and say, honey, God gave this wonderful gift to us, pure, innocent, blameless. It is our job, as long as we live, to make sure they make it back to Him the same way. That is our God-given task. That is huge. The things that we own, our possessions, physical possessions, but also our sphere of influence, is very important. I want to go ahead and put these up because we're just going to make it to the first point tonight. We'll talk about the past and the future next week. But when I look at how Solomon is saying, look, don't turn to God and say, God, this is your fault. Or, sorry, God, you just put your trust in the wrong person. Did God make a mistake by putting Saul as the first king of Israel? Oh. Okay, so defend your answer. Why are we saying no? So is it the people's fault that Saul sinned? I mean, it was their intent. God knew they were going to ask for it, and they ultimately got what they wanted. But was Saul who Saul was because God simply made him to be that, and He knew Saul was going to fail? Okay, so what else had to happen? If it wasn't the people's fault and it wasn't God's fault, why did Saul turn out the way Saul did? Saul never saw it coming. It was his choices, and that's the concept here. I want us to look at 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 3. We could look at Psalm 12, which really the idea is that God has put man here to be pure and undefiled, but it's man who ultimately makes those choices. In 2 Thessalonians, there is a weird concept that is called the man of sin. And a lot of people associate this with the book of Revelation, where they talk about, oh, this is the Antichrist, and when the man of sin comes up, who, depending on whatever generation you grew up in, is Jimmy Carter, it's George Bush, it's Bill Clinton, it's George Bush Jr., it's Obama, it's Trump, it's Joe Biden. It's for some reason only an American president. And some people will say, it's Putin. Okay, he's not American. Why are you saying? Because people misapply what this means. When you look in 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2, the concept that Paul is trying to emphasize to the congregation here is that you have a choice to determine whether or not you're going to sin. And when that desire to want to sin appears in your life, and we go back to Genesis 4, where God would tell Cain, be careful. Why is your countenance fallen? Sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you. I need to know there's going to be times where I'm going to let down my guard, and I'm going to want to do something that I know is not right. Notice in chapter 2, the way that Paul describes this. In verse number 2, don't soon be shaken in mind or troubled either by spirit or by word or by letter as if from us, as if Jesus had already come. Don't let anyone deceive you by any means, for Jesus will not return. That day will not come unless a falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed. The son of perdition, who is this? The one who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Paraphrase, it's my life, I'll do whatever I want. If it brings me pleasure, if it brings me happiness, you don't get to tell me what to do. Quite literally, king of my life, I crown me now. That's not how that song goes. But the son of perdition, or the one of darkness, wickedness that we find here, is the individual who simply is proud and puts himself above God. Notice in verse number 5, Paul would say, do you not remember when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. I know exactly what barricades I may have put up or have failed to put up so that I can keep myself from sinning in the areas that I know I'm going to sin in. Or maybe this is going to be a problem down the road, and I'm trying to build barricades in time so that I know when I'm faced with that predicament, I've already worked out my battle plan for that problem. And that's what Paul is saying. Be prepared for what you think you're going to encounter. If you don't prepare for the things that may tempt you or cause you to fall, then you've allowed the man of sin, the son of perdition, the one who's bound to receive God's wrath, you're bound to receive those things. And notice in verse number 10, these individuals are those who, with all unrighteousness, deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. If I refuse to try to build those barricades, the Bible would tell me I do not love God. I'm not honest. And in my dishonesty, notice in verse number 11, for this reason God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. This is not God forcing people to do things. If you think that's how you should live life, in God's love and how He made you and I, He'll let you do it. Doesn't mean He accepts or He's proud of or loves what you're doing, because we're free moral agents. It's your life and it is your choice. But this text is telling me, be mindful every action, every thought. It has a consequence. It could be positive, but it could be bad if it goes against what God says. Notice in verse 13, the admonition here for the individual level. We're bound to give thanks to God always for you, brethren, beloved by the Lord, because God from the beginning chose you for salvation through sanctification of the Spirit, set apart by what the Spirit instructs us to do, and belief in the truth, to which He called you by our gospel for the obtaining of the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or our epistles. I find it interesting that even Paul is encouraging the brethren here, that you have a standard to help guide you. You have all the wisdom and instruction that you need to live holy before God. You make those choices as mature children of God. In fact, I like to think of it this way. If I put myself in the time of Paul's time, or even those during the times of Solomon, and this is going to transition into our next part. Man's heart is bound to sin if preventative measures are not made. As I look into myself, and I look into the place that's called my heart. I've got to critically examine, why am I doing what I'm doing? Like, what's my actual drive in this? I find it interesting that Solomon will say over and over again in Ecclesiastes, God will give you the joys of your heart. He will. But then I have to re-examine that. Hold on, are those joys going to take me away from what He wills? And that puts me in a predicament. When you look in Hosea chapter 6, we know this kind of in paraphrase, but when you look at the text, this is not a good text. Mercy I have desired rather than sacrifice. What does that mean from God's perspective? And when I look at Hosea chapter 6, what I ultimately find out is that God's people started saying certain things or doing certain things that God never told them to do at all. In fact, in the beginning part of the chapter, it is a call of repentance. Turn back to God. You've fallen in your own wickedness. And notice in verse number 4 of chapter 6, O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? God says. O Judah, what shall I do to you? Your faithfulness is like the morning cloud, and like the early dew, it goes away. You're good for a moment, and then you ever said this? I took my eye off you for 1 second, and look at all this destruction. God says, my own people, you say you love me, therefore I've hewn them. Verse 5, by the prophets, I've slain them by the words of my mouth, that in your judgments are like light that goes forth. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. God is simply not interested in, and this drives me up the wall. I understand in light of church attendance, there are a lot of sermons that I'd love to give about this. But here's the big point. If you simply come to services because the Bible tells you to come to services, I think you're missing the whole point of building a relationship with God. God is not interested in you in simply just filling a pew. I mean, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. But that's not all of the beauty of worshiping or learning about God. Notice his emphasis here is knowledge. If I want to know more about someone that I claim to love, what am I going to do towards that individual if I claim to really love them? Religion would say, just talk to them maybe for an hour, maybe less than that because you're running late that day, 1 hour out of the week, and you'll have the strongest relationship ever seen. How do you actually build a good relationship with someone? How do y'all have friends? I'm not saying that in a rhetorical, sarcastic way. How do you have friends? You talk. What do you talk about? Anything. Now, just because everything's on the table to talk about does not necessitate you should talk about everything. But I mean, if it's someone you love and you find yourself, I could probably spend the rest of my life with this person, and you talk to them more, you find out what their likes and dislikes are. You see them on their good days and their bad days. The wonderful thing about God is that He's never had a bad day. There's probably bad days in human history where He said, I do not like that day. Compared to any other day, I do not like that day. But the only way I'm going to get to build a good, godly relationship with someone that I say that I love and I care about, I will spend more time and brain power and deeds for trying to build that relationship and make it stronger. How do you do that with God? He tells you. That's the concept. Look through the Scriptures. What do you see about the heart of God that's different in Genesis as opposed to Exodus? Is it a different God? Some people have those ideas that the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament. No, I think there were a bunch of brats in the Old Testament, and God was displaying, as a firm parent would to normally their first child or their very rebellious second child, discipline, discipline, discipline. No wonder it looks terrible for the person who didn't commit that atrocity, because I haven't done it yet. So yes, I would be afraid if I saw my only other older sibling get in trouble, but normally I would set the example of what not to do. And that's not something I'm proud of. The Bible does the same thing for us. we can see the lives and actions of other individuals in their choices, and especially in Saul's case, and any other king that simply failed in their obligation to be a king. God put them in a position that he would say in Exodus 9, even to Pharaoh, I put you in this position that I may display my power through you, that the world may know that I am the Lord. You may not be a king in a palace, but where you are, whether you're a parent, you're a worker at some business, you're a friend, you're a husband, a wife, a grandmother, grandfather, male or female, God has put you in that position so that the world can know who the Lord is. So how do you use the position that God has placed you in life to glorify him? And how do you use that position in life so that you better know, not you better know, but that you can know better God and truly see how beautiful God is? That's what God wants us to do now. So as we end with these words, what does your heart say to you about your feelings towards God? Thank you for your time and attention. We'll come back to this idea when we begin looking at observing answers from the past. So we will bring up Saul again next week. But thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back in just a few moments.